The auctioneer's voice cracked through the cold dawn air like a whip, and Ellen Keating stood on the raised platform in the center of Caldwell, Kansas, her wrists bound together with a length of rough hemp rope, her green eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the crowd of men who had gathered to purchase her like a piece of livestock. It was the spring of 1879, and the sky above the town square was the color of a bruise, purple and gray and swollen with rain that had not yet fallen. She had been standing there for 20 minutes. Not a single hand had gone up. $5, the auctioneer, a thin, sweating man named Orville Pratt, called out again, his voice losing its earlier confidence. $5 for a woman of sound health and strong constitution, capable of cooking, sewing, and managing a household. $5, gentlemen. Surely someone sees the value. The crowd of men shifted, muttered, looked at the mud on their boots. Ellen felt the shame of it press against her chest like a stone, but she did not look down. She had promised herself she would not look down. Her dark hair was loose and damp from the morning air, and her dress, which had once been a lovely shade of blue, was stained at the hem with the rust-colored mud of the Kansas plain. She was 23 years old. She had survived 3 years of debt, a dead father, a crooked guardian, a forged contract, and 2 weeks in a Wichita jail cell for a crime she had not committed. She was not going to survive this morning by breaking. The crowd grew restless. 2 men near the back laughed about something unrelated. A dog barked somewhere on the far end of Main Street. Orville Pratt wiped his forehead with a yellowed handkerchief and raised his voice one more time. "Last call, gentlemen. Last call at $5. After that, the county magistrate has directed that this woman be returned to the custody of Harlan Voss." And that was when the door of the Silver Creek saloon swung open, and a man walked out into the rain that had just begun to fall. He was tall, with dark hair plastered against his forehead by the sudden downpour, his long canvas duster coat dark with water. He walked with the calm, deliberate stride of a man who had decided something and was not in the habit of changing his mind. The crowd parted without quite knowing why. He stopped at the edge of the platform, looked at Orville Pratt with pale gray eyes that held the expression of a man who had seen a great many things he had not approved of, and raised his hand. $20, Isaac Keller said. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight and texture. Orville Pratt stared. The crowd stared. Ellen Keating looked at the stranger for the first time, and something happened inside her chest that she did not have a name for yet, something that was not gratitude and was not quite hope and was not quite fear, but was made up of all three in equal measure. What had led her to this platform, to this dawn auction with no bidders, to this moment of absolute exposure, had begun 3 months earlier and 300 miles to the south, in a place called Redemption Creek, Texas, where Ellen had made the worst and most necessary decision of her life. She had grown up in Redemption Creek with her father, Thomas Keating, who ran the only general store in a town of 400 souls. Thomas Keating was a decent man in most respects, generous with credit during lean seasons, honest with his weights and measures. But he had one catastrophic weakness, and that weakness was a card table. By the time Ellen was 18, the store was mortgaged. By the time she was 20, the mortgage had been sold twice. By the time she was 21, her father had died of a fever in January, leaving behind a daughter, a mule, $14 in cash, and a debt of $860 owed to a man named Harlan Voss. Harlan Voss owned everything in Redemption Creek that was worth owning. He owned the bank, the grain mill, and 3 of the 4 saloons. He was 51 years old, with the build of a man who had once worked hard and now preferred to let others do it for him. He had small, pale eyes and large, capable hands and a voice that was perpetually smooth, as if every word he spoke had been rehearsed. He had been looking at Ellen Keating with a specific kind of attention since she was 19 years old, and her father's death had given him the legal mechanism to act on that attention. He arrived at the store 2 days after Thomas Keating's funeral, with a copy of the debt agreement and a county sheriff named Brewster who owed Voss more favors than he could count. He explained, with great patience and smoothness, that the debt was secured against all assets of the Keating estate, which now included the store, the mule, the $14, and as next of kin and sole heir, Ellen herself, whose labor contract could be legally transferred under the territory's indentured service statutes. "That statute applies to voluntary contracts," Ellen said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced being steady. "Your father signed a voluntary labor addendum in August of last year," Voss said, placing a document on the counter. "I have a witness." She looked at the document. Her father's signature was there, but it was wrong. She had seen her father's signature 10,000 times on 10,000 receipts and invoices and credit slips. The capital T was always slightly tilted, the loop of the G in Keating always extended below the line. This signature had neither quality. It was a decent forgery, but it was a forgery. She said so, aloud, looking directly at Voss. He smiled. Sheriff Brewster put his hand on his gun belt, not drawing, just resting it there, which was its own kind of statement. "Miss Keating," Voss said, "you have two choices. You sign a labor agreement with me, which will be comfortable and well compensated, or I take this matter before Judge Caldwell, who is a personal friend of mine, and we see what the courts make of a woman who is challenging a legally witnessed contract with nothing but her own word." She chose a third option. She packed what she could carry in one bag, left before dawn the following morning, and ran. She ran north, catching a cattle drive at the Red River crossing that took her as far as Wichita. She worked 2 weeks in a Wichita laundry, saving every cent, planning to continue north to Abilene or Ellsworth, somewhere far enough that Voss's reach would not extend. But Voss's reach was longer than she had estimated. He had sent 2 men after her, men with a warrant from Judge Caldwell that described Ellen Keating as having absconded with property belonging to Harlan Voss, namely the $14 in cash from the store register. It was technically true that she had taken the money. It had never occurred to her that this would be characterized as theft. It occurred to her now, at 2 in the morning, when the Wichita marshal came to the laundry with lanterns and chains. She spent 12 days in the Wichita jail. During those 12 days, a county clerk named Patterson, who had a conscience and a sister in a similar situation, helped her file a counter-complaint disputing the validity of the original debt contract. Patterson explained that her best chance was to get the matter before a federal circuit judge rather than a territorial one, and that the nearest federal circuit was in Caldwell, 30 miles to the south, near the Kansas Indian Territory border. Getting to Caldwell required a transfer. The transfer went wrong. A transport wagon broke an axle on a creek crossing. In the confusion, the deputy transporting her lost 2 prisoners, recovered 1, and filed a report that listed Ellen as an escaped detainee. By the time she arrived in Caldwell, as a result of a good Samaritan named Mrs. Clara Finch, who found her sitting in the mud on the bank of Bluff Creek and fed her soup, Ellen Keating had warrants outstanding in 2 counties, a legal claim against her that she could not afford to fight, and a reputation in the local records as an escaped criminal. Caldwell, in the spring of 1879, was a border town in every sense of the word. It sat at the southern edge of Kansas, at the head of the Kishom Trail, and it was a place where cattle, money, violence, and desperate people all arrived in significant quantities, and where the law was a thing that could be bought and shaped and worn like a coat. The county magistrate, a man named Aldridge, had an informal arrangement with creditors and debt collectors to facilitate resolution of labor disputes in ways that were efficient and financially satisfactory to all parties. Which was a long way of saying that when Harlan Voss sent a telegraph from Redemption Creek, Texas, describing Ellen Keating as an indentured debtor who had absconded, Magistrate Aldridge made arrangements. Those arrangements were what had placed Ellen on the platform at dawn with her wrists bound, in a system that the county formally described as a debt resolution auction, and that was, by any honest accounting, a human sale. She had spent the night before in a room above the magistrate's office, not chained, which was a small mercy, but locked, which removed the value of it. She had lain on a straw mattress and stared at the ceiling and thought about every decision she had made and every decision that had been made for her, and tried to find the one that, if she had made it differently, would have led to a different morning. She could not find it. The trap had been built before she was old enough to see it. She thought about her father, about the easy laughter he used to have before the debts grew too large, and the laughter became something he had to work at. She thought about the store, about the smell of dried beans and axle grease and the cedar planks of the counter. She thought about the life she had wanted, which was not a grand or complex life, only a life she chose for herself, which turned out to be the most difficult kind to obtain. In the morning, they walked her to the platform, and Orville Pratt began the auction, and nobody bid, and the rain came, and Isaac Keller walked out of the Silver Creek saloon with $20. Isaac Keller had arrived in Caldwell the previous afternoon, having ridden 4 days from Dodge City, with a pulled shoulder muscle. $2 less than he expected because of a broken saddle strap he had to have repaired in a town called Harper, and a commission from a ranching operation called the Double Cross Outfit to scout available land for a cattle run south through the Indian Territory to the markets in Texas. He was 30 years old, and he had been working as a trail scout and occasional land surveyor since he was 22. He was from Missouri originally, from a small farm outside of Joplin, and he had left at 18 after his mother died, and his father made clear that the farm would go to the eldest son and that Isaac, as the third son, would need to make his own way. He had not resented this entirely. He was not built for farming. He was built for movement, for the kind of thinking that happened better on horseback than at a table. He had been in the saloon since the previous evening, not drinking heavily but listening, which was a habit of his. You could learn almost everything worth knowing about a town by sitting in its saloon after midnight and paying attention. He had learned that there was a federal land dispute with the Cherokee Outlet complicating any southward cattle route. He had learned that Magistrate Aldridge was corrupt in specific and predictable ways. He had learned that there was a woman being held above the magistrate's office on a debt warrant that several of the more sober patrons of the Silver Creek found troubling but not troubling enough to act on. He had tried to sleep on the cot in the back room he had rented. He could not sleep. He was not a man who was troubled by abstract injustice in the way that kept him awake. He was troubled by specific things, and the specific thing he had heard in the saloon, described by a bartender named Cross who had a plain-spoken decency about him, was specific enough to keep him on the cot staring at the ceiling. He went out into the rain when he heard the auctioneer's voice, because he had known since approximately 2 in the morning that he was going to, and he had spent the intervening hours arguing with himself about it and losing the argument. The $20 he bid was slightly more than half of everything he had in his wallet. He did not examine this fact too closely at the time. What happened after he raised his hand unfolded quickly, because Orville Pratt was a man who was anxious to have the business concluded. The paperwork was produced. Isaac signed it, not reading it as carefully as he should have, which he would later reflect on. He paid the $20 in bills. A man with a ring of keys unlocked the rope from Ellen's wrists, which were red and slightly raw at the edges. Isaac did not look at her directly while all of this was happening. He did not know what to do with looking at her directly. They walked off the platform into the rain. He handed her his extra coat from his saddlebag, which was a different coat from the duster he was wearing, a worn brown wool coat that was dry on the inside even if the outside was damp. She put it on without speaking. He led his horse, a gray roan gelding named Steady, and they walked down the main street of Caldwell in the morning rain until they reached a covered porch at the front of a dry goods store that had not yet opened for the day. They stood under the porch, and the rain came down in gray sheets, and Ellen Keating looked at Isaac Keller with those green eyes and said, "I want to be clear about something before we go any further." He looked at her. She was wet and cold, and there was mud on her dress, and her wrists were sore, and her hair was in disarray. And she was holding herself with the dignity of a woman who was fully aware of how undignified her circumstances were, and had decided not to let that be the determining factor. "What you did back there," she said, "I am grateful for it. Sincerely. But I am not property. Whatever that paper says, I am not bound to you or to anyone. I want you to know that I understand what it cost you, and I intend to repay it every cent, but I will not be purchased." Isaac looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I don't own property." She waited. "What I signed," he said, "was a debt transfer. According to that document, you now owe $20 to me instead of to whatever arrangement Magistrate Aldridge had going with your original creditor. I have no interest in collecting it. The way I see it, you can walk in whatever direction you need to walk, and I will report to Aldridge that you fulfilled your obligation by working in some capacity for approximately 20 minutes, which is how long you stood on that platform. And if he wants to argue the accounting with me, he is welcome to try." Ellen studied him. "That is not how any of this works legally." "Probably not," Isaac agreed. "But Aldridge is corrupt, and corrupt men usually prefer to avoid attention from anyone who might start asking questions about their practices. I can be fairly persistent when I ask questions." She continued studying him. The rain hammered the porch roof. A rooster crowed somewhere in the back of a nearby property, confused about the darkness of the morning. "Why?" she asked. It was the simplest and most important question. He took a moment with it. He was not a man who gave quick answers to important questions, which was either a virtue or a frustration depending on what you needed from him at any given moment. "Because it was wrong," he said finally. "What was happening up there was wrong in a way that I could do something about, and that is generally where I draw the line between things that are not my concern and things that are." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she said, "My name is Ellen Keating." "Isaac Keller," he said. They shook hands under the porch in the rain, which was perhaps an unusual way to begin what would become the most significant relationship of either of their lives, but it was authentic, which was more valuable than usual. Over the following hour, still on the porch as the rain continued, Ellen told him the essential facts of her situation with a directness and clarity that he respected. She told him about her father's death and the debt in Harlan Voss and the forged contract and the Wichita jail and the broken axle and arriving in Caldwell. She did not editorialize. She did not ask for sympathy. She presented the facts in sequence and let them speak. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The forged contract is the key." "I know it is," she said, "which is why I need to get before a federal circuit judge." "There is a federal circuit sitting in Wichita in 6 weeks, Isaac said. He knew this because he had been planning to register a land claim there in connection with the Double Cross Commission. "Getting back to Wichita without being arrested again on the outstanding warrant is the problem," Ellen said. "I can ride you to Wichita," Isaac said. She looked at him sharply. "You just spent half your wallet on a stranger's auction price. You are not also required to ride 3 days out of your way. The federal circuit is exactly where I need to be in 6 weeks for my own business," he said. "So it is not entirely altruistic. We would be traveling in the same direction." "What is your business there?" He told her about the Double Cross outfit and the Land Survey Commission, and the need to register the claim before filing the route application. She listened with the same careful attention she had given him when she was telling her own story, which he noticed, and which struck him as a mark of genuine character rather than politeness. "You said you know how to survey land?" she asked. "I have a commission as a deputy surveyor from the Federal Land Office," he said. "Not a full commission. It requires a co-signature from a licensed surveyor on any official filing, but I can run the measurements and read the instruments. My father used to do the bookkeeping for 2 ranchers in Redemption Creek," she said. "I helped him with it from the time I was 14. I understand land maps and parcel boundaries. Could that be useful?" "It could be," he said. He meant it. They left Caldwell that morning, before the rain stopped and before Magistrate Aldridge had an opportunity to reconsider his arrangement. Isaac bought supplies at a trading post at the edge of town, flour and salt pork and coffee, and a second bedroll, using money he had not planned to spend, money that was supposed to cover the next 2 weeks of travel, which meant that the financial calculation of this journey was already significantly different from the one he had started the week with. He did not find this especially troubling. He had never been a man who was controlled by his financial calculations. Ellen rode behind him unsteady for the first 3 miles, which was awkward and uncomfortable for both of them in the particular way that close proximity to a stranger is uncomfortable. The awareness of breath and body heat, and the small movements of balance. He stopped at a livestock trader's post at the edge of a creek crossing and purchased a second horse, a solid bay mare with a white blaze, for $12. This left him with less than $8 and the prospect of needing to wire the double-cross outfit for an advance, which he had never done before and was not enthusiastic about doing. Ellen said, "I told you I will repay you. I mean it." "I know you mean it," he said. "That is not why I'm concerned." "Then what are you concerned about?" "Whether the mare has soft feet," he said, which was entirely true and also a deflection from the more honest answer, which was that he was not concerned about the money at all, and was instead occupied by a more complex and less familiar sensation that he had not yet identified clearly enough to speak to. They rode north along the Kisham Trail, which was deeply familiar to Isaac and entirely new to Ellen, who had never been this far north. The Kansas plain in spring was a particular kind of beautiful, enormous and flat, and covered with the new green of buffalo grass, and the pale yellow of wild indigo just coming into bloom. The sky, once the rain cleared mid-morning, went from pewter to a deep, washed blue with the kind of clarity that only came after a hard rain. Ellen rode the bay mare with a competence that surprised him, until he remembered she had grown up on the edge of cattle country, where everyone who survived learned to ride. They did not talk constantly, which he appreciated. There were long stretches of the morning where the only sounds were the horses' footfalls on the wet trail and the wind, and the occasional call of a meadowlark or a killdeer from the grass. These silences were not uncomfortable. He thought about this later and realized that the absence of discomfort in silence with a near stranger was notable enough to note. When they did talk, in the late morning and early afternoon, it began with practical things. She asked about the federal circuit court, about what kind of evidence would be persuasive against a forged contract, about whether a county clerk's counter-complaint would carry weight with a federal judge. He answered honestly, which meant acknowledging the limits of his knowledge. He had dealt with federal land courts but not with debt and contract disputes, and he told her so. He suggested that she find a lawyer in Wichita, someone who operated at the federal level and had no connection to either Aldridge's network or Harlan Voss's influence. "How do you find a lawyer you can trust in a town you've never lived in with essentially no money?" she asked. "You ask the right people," he said. "Bartenders and preachers. They hear everything, and they usually know who the honest men are because the honest men are their best customers and their most charitable donors respectively." She laughed at this. It was the first time she had laughed since the platform, and it was genuine, not performed. It changed her face in a way that was interesting to observe. She had a good face, not soft in the way that was fashionable in illustration and portraiture, but strong, with high cheekbones and a jaw that suggested decisiveness, and when she laughed it became something warmer without losing the strength. He found, to his own mild surprise, that he was glad to have made her laugh. They camped the first night on the bank of a creek called Hackberry, where there was a stand of cottonwood for shelter and good grass for the horses. He built a fire with dry wood from the sheltered side of a fallen trunk, the kind of skill that came from 8 years of sleeping outdoors more often than in. She made the coffee, and it was the best coffee he had tasted in 2 weeks, which was a low bar given the quality of the Silver Creek saloon's offering, but still. "Where did you learn to make coffee like this?" he asked. The cattle drivers who stopped at our store would sometimes trade a meal's worth of good arbuckles for a lower credit rate, she said. I used to negotiate those trades with the trail boss myself, starting when I was about 15. My father said I was better at it than he was. Were you? Yes, she said simply. He smiled into his tin cup. He had noticed that she did not perform false modesty, which was a quality he found rare and valuable. The firelight made the shadows move across the cottonwood trunks, and the creek made its steady sound beside them, and the Kansas night was cold with the particular cleanness of spring cold, and the stars over the plain were brilliant and dense. They sat on opposite sides of the fire on their respective bedrolls, and the intimacy of the situation was apparent to both of them without being spoken. Two strangers who had met in perhaps the most extraordinary and undignified circumstances imaginable, sharing a fire in the dark. He told her, because the darkness and the fire and the particular quality of the evening made telling things feel natural, about his family in Missouri. About his father, who had been a hard man but not a cruel one, a man formed entirely by necessity and weather, and the grinding arithmetic of farming on marginal land. About his two older brothers, Daniel and Frank, who had divided the farm between them after their father died and were probably still there, plowing the same fields, which was not a life Isaac regretted missing, but also not one he could bring himself to judge. She told him about her father's laughter, about the way the store had smelled, about the specific sadness of watching a good man diminish under the weight of a debt he could not escape. There was something in the way she told it that was tender without being sentimental, honest about the grief without being swamped by it. "Do you think he knew the contract was forged?" he asked carefully. She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said finally. "He would never have signed anything that put me at risk. Voss must have forged it after his death, using a copy of my father's signature from the original debt agreement. Voss had dozens of those in his files." "That is what you need to prove to the federal judge," he said. "Not just that the signature is wrong, but that Voss had the means and the motive to forge it. Do you have any of your father's legitimate paperwork? Receipts, invoices, anything with his real signature?" She reached into the bag she had been carrying when she left the platform. It was not much, a worn leather satchel that had her father's initials on the brass clasp, TK, half worn away but still visible. She withdrew from it carefully a folded paper. "His last letter to me," she said, "written 2 weeks before he died. I had it in my coat pocket the night I left. I have never put it anywhere it could be taken from me." He did not ask to see it. It was private and he respected private things. But he said, "Keep that letter. It may be the most important piece of evidence you have." She looked at him across the fire. The expression on her face was not easy to read, which was unusual for a woman whose expressions were generally direct. It was something that combined wariness and something softer, the beginning of trust in someone you were not yet certain you should trust, a thing that requires courage to feel when the previous people you had extended trust to had used it badly. They slept with the fire between them, and in the morning they rode north. The second day was warmer, the sun coming full and strong out of a sky without a single cloud, and the prairie showing all its spring colors, the deep burgundy of Indian paintbrush coming up along the creek beds they crossed, the gold of sunflowers beginning at the roadsides, the flat green endlessness of the buffalo grass that stretched in every direction to the precise flat horizon. Steady and the bay mare, whom Ellen had named Clover because of the way she kept trying to stop and graze in the clover patches along the trail, moved at a comfortable walk, and the miles passed under an uncomplicated sky. In the afternoon of the second day, a complication arrived in the form of 3 riders coming south on the trail at a pace that was slightly too deliberate. Isaac saw them when they were still a quarter-mile off and felt the particular alertness that 8 years of trail life had developed in him. He said quietly, without turning his head, "3 riders coming. They are riding at a pace that is not a natural traveling pace. They are looking at us." Ellen, who had also been watching the horizon with her own acquired wariness, said, "Could they be Voss's men?" "I do not know what Voss's men look like," he said. "Do you?" "He had two in Wichita who came after me the first time," she said. "One was tall, red-haired. I cannot see these men well enough yet." "Keep riding," he said. "Normal pace. Do not show that you have noticed." The three riders came up along the trail and then slowed as they drew close, pulling their horses to a walk and passing with the kind of examination that was just barely on the right side of confrontational. One of them, the middle one, was tall and red-haired. Ellen's posture, which Isaac was monitoring from his peripheral vision, went fractionally rigid. They passed. They did not stop or speak. Isaac kept riding. "That was one of them," Ellen said very quietly, "the red-haired one." "I know," he said. "Keep riding." "Do not look back for 60 seconds, he counted. At 60 seconds, he turned steady at an angle to check the trail behind them. The three riders had stopped 100 yards back and were turned around, watching. "We need to change our route," he said. "There is a town called Wellington about 12 miles west. We can cut across the plain and reach it by nightfall. It has a proper sheriff, not a Voss man who I have dealt with before. His name is Earl Dunning. If Voss has sent men with a warrant, Dunning will at least look at the warrant before acting on it, which buys us time. Can you trust Dunning?" "I trust him to follow the law as he understands it," Isaac said. "That is not complete trust, but it is more than we have in the open." They turned west off the Kisham Trail, cutting across the open plain at a canter. The land here was not as obviously easy to navigate without a trail, but Isaac had surveyed much of this territory in the previous 2 years, and he read the landscape with the ease of a man for whom it was a kind of language. He kept a line of low hills to the northwest as a bearing and angled across the grass, checking the sun's position and the length of shadows for direction. Ellen rode beside him now, because there was no trail narrow enough to require single file, and they covered the 12 miles in a little over 2 hours, arriving at Wellington as the sun was going red and low in the west. The town was larger than Caldwell, with a proper main street, a hardware store and a land office and 2 hotels, and a sheriff's office that had its own jail and the look of an institution that was taken seriously. Isaac found Earl Dunning at his desk, a stocky, gray-haired man in his 50s who wore his badge with the straightforward confidence of a man who had earned it. He greeted Isaac with a handshake that indicated genuine familiarity rather than simple professional courtesy, and he listened to what Isaac told him, which was a carefully selected version of the complete truth, enough to establish the situation without detailing every complication. He told Dunning about the debt warrant from Caldwell, about the potentially fraudulent contract behind it, about the federal circuit court case they were traveling toward, and about the 3 riders who appeared to be following them. He did not describe Ellen as the woman from the auction. He described her as a client he had contracted to escort to a legal proceeding, which was close enough to true. Dunning looked at Ellen with the measured assessment of a man who made quick and generally accurate character judgments. "You have paperwork for this federal case?" he asked her. "The case has not been formally filed yet," she said. "I have the counter-complaint that was initiated in Wichita by a county clerk named Patterson. I can produce it." She had it, folded carefully in the satchel with her father's letter. Dunning read it, and then said, "I will telegraph the Wichita Federal Court Office tonight to confirm this is a pending matter. If those 3 riders come through Wellington and show me a warrant for you, I will look at it, and if it is a local warrant from a county magistrate attempting to override a pending federal proceeding, I will tell them exactly where to put it. That is all I can promise." It was enough. They stayed in Wellington that night in one of the hotels, in separate rooms, which Isaac paid for with the last of his cash and a promissory note drawn on the double-cross account, which required him to explain the situation to the hotel proprietor, who turned out to have dealt with double-cross cattle on 2 previous occasions and extended the credit without significant complaint. He slid a note under Ellen's door before he went to his own room. It said, "We should reach Wichita in 2 more days. You are safe tonight. I will be in the room at the end of the hall." That was all. It was not eloquent. He was not by training or inclination an eloquent man. But he meant every word of it, and he thought that was worth more than eloquence in the long run. She kept the note. She did not know why. She put it in the satchel with the letter and the counter-complaint. The 3 writers did not appear in Wellington. Dunning reported in the morning that he had received the telegraph confirmation from Wichita that the counter-complaint was a registered pending matter, and that any warrant in conflict with it would require federal review. He gave Isaac a copy of this telegraph, which was not precisely legally binding, but was the kind of document that would give a corrupt local man pause. They rode northeast from Wellington into the remaining distance to Wichita with that document in Isaac's breast pocket and a slightly different quality of ease between them, as if the shared managed crisis had shifted something in the atmosphere. They talked more on the 3rd day, and the talking was less careful, less selected, more like the natural conversation of 2 people who had decided, without quite saying so, that they were not entirely strangers anymore. He told her about the first time he had done a land survey, at 22, for a railroad company in Missouri, using borrowed instruments because he had not yet been able to afford his own. He told her about the particular satisfaction of a correctly measured line, the way the precision of it was a kind of honesty. The ground does not lie if you measure it accurately. She listened and then said she understood that feeling, that bookkeeping had given her something similar. The way a set of accounts that balanced was a kind of confirmation that the world had an underlying order even when the surface evidence was against it. "Do you still believe that?" she asked. "In the underlying order," he thought about it. "Most days," he said, "some days less. Today." He looked at her, riding beside him in the Kansas morning, with the sun making her dark hair warm and the green of her eyes something that was not easy to look at directly without consequence. "Today more," he said. She looked forward. He could not see her expression from the angle, but he saw the slight change in her posture that suggested the words had arrived somewhere. In Wichita, they went first to the federal court office, where a clerk confirmed the pending status of the counter-complaint and scheduled a hearing date 7 weeks out. Then Isaac took her, as promised, to find a lawyer by consulting first a bartender at a saloon called the Drovers Club, which was a respectable establishment in the Kansas sense, meaning it had actual chairs, and then a Congregationalist minister on 3rd Street who had a reputation for directing troubled parishioners to honest professional help. Both the bartender and the minister pointed them to the same name, a lawyer called Henry Marsh, who operated a practice out of a brick building on Douglas Avenue, and whose reputation for handling territorial debt and contract law against fraudulent creditors was well established. He was a thin, energetic man of about 45 with quick eyes and ink-stained fingers who listened to Ellen's account with the focused attention of a man who recognized both the legal intricacy and the personal stakes of what she was telling him. When she was finished, he asked to see the counter-complaint and the letter. He read both carefully. He held the letter up to the light from his window and studied the handwriting for a long moment. "The signature in the counter-complaint's description of the disputed contract," he said, "differs from this letter in at least 3 characteristics I can already identify without a formal analysis. That is promising. What I need is a handwriting expert who can testify to those differences before the circuit court. I know one in Kansas City. It will cost money to bring him." Ellen looked at Isaac. Isaac said, "How much?" Marsh named a figure. It was $40, which was more than Isaac currently possessed and more than Ellen had, but it was not impossible. Isaac had the double-cross commission wire due in 10 days, and he still had his surveying equipment, which was worth a good deal more than $40. "I can cover it," Isaac said. "Send for the man." Ellen turned to look at him then with an expression that was different from any she had shown before, not the wariness or the assessment or the gratitude from the auction platform, something more complex, something in which all the defenses she had very reasonably constructed over the previous 3 years were visibly and with great effort being set aside. "You do not have to keep doing this," she said. Her voice was very even, which meant she was working to keep it so. "I know," he said. "You have spent almost everything you have on a situation that is not yours. The situation has become mine," he said. "I am not entirely clear on when that happened, but it did." She looked at him for a long moment in Marsh's office, with Marsh tactfully examining his papers, and then she said, "Then I want to be clear about something else." "What?" "Whatever is happening between us," she said, "I would like it to happen honestly. I have had enough of things being done to me or for me without my full understanding and participation. If you are developing feelings of a specific kind, I would prefer to know it." He met her eyes. He was a man who did not generally discuss feelings of a specific kind, partly by temperament and partly by the particular formation of a man who had spent most of his adult life with only horses and the outdoors as consistent companions. But she was asking directly and honestly, and she had made clear that honesty was both what she needed and what she deserved, and so he said, very directly, "I am." I was aware of it from approximately the second morning, which I recognize is a very short time to be aware of something like that, and I am not asking you to feel the same or to feel anything in particular, but you asked honestly, and I am answering honestly. She held his gaze. Then she said, with equal directness and a small, careful smile that was different from the full laugh but in its own way more affecting, "I find that I am not entirely opposed." They stayed in Wichita. Isaac wired the double-cross outfit and explained the situation, which resulted in a terse reply from the outfit's foreman that was not thrilled but which authorized a partial advance on the commission. He found a room in a boarding house on First Street run by a woman named Mrs. Garland, who also happened to have a vacant room across the hall, which Ellen rented at a rate they negotiated to something manageable. The boarding house was clean and properly run, Mrs. Garland being a woman of strict and organized temperament who ran her establishment the way a well-made clock runs, and its conventions were observed by both of them without discussion. Isaac had work to do. The Double-Cross Land Survey Commission required him to compile preliminary data from existing federal land records before the court filing, and the Federal Land Office in Wichita had records going back to the original territorial surveys of the 1860s. He spent his days there, working through the records with the methodical patience that his work demanded. Ellen, who had nothing to do while Marsh prepared the case except wait, found her way to the land office after 2 days. She appeared at his table one morning with a cup of coffee and the straightforward observation that she had been going somewhat mad sitting in the boarding house, and that if there was anything in his land survey work that could use a second pair of eyes, she was prepared to offer hers. He showed her the record system, explained what he was looking for, and within 2 hours had determined that she had both a genuine aptitude for the archival work and a speed at cross-referencing parcel records that exceeded his own. She had a memory for numbers and spatial relationships that he recognized as rare, the kind of mind that could hold multiple overlapping datasets and find relationships between them. They worked together in the land office every day for 3 weeks. There was a particular quality to working closely alongside someone whose mind you genuinely respect, a quality that is intimate in a way that proximity and conversation sometimes are not. You learn a person's patterns of thought, where they are fast and where they slow down, where their attention catches and where it moves past. He learned that she was fastest with numerical cross-referencing and slowest on the legal description language, which was specialized and arcane and required familiarity with survey terminology she had not previously encountered. He was faster with the legal descriptions, and he taught her the terminology over the course of those weeks in the incremental, easy way that teaching goes well when both people are genuinely engaged. She learned that he was methodical to the point of stubbornness when he had determined a correct approach to a problem, and that he had a dry, underplayed sense of humor that emerged only in specific conditions, generally when something had gone significantly sideways, and he chose to address it with absurdist commentary rather than distress. One afternoon, a box of records they had been working with turned out to have been mislabeled and contained entirely the wrong decade of data, which required them to request the correct box and wait while the clerk located it. While they waited, Isaac looked at the mislabeled box and said, "I once spent 3 weeks surveying a section of land in Colorado that turned out to belong to a different survey entirely because the landmark I used as a starting point had been moved by a landslide 6 months prior. I did not discover this until the filing, which was rejected." Ellen looked at him. "What did you do?" "I resurveyed it," he said. "It took another 3 weeks." "Were you angry?" He considered. "I was frustrated, but the land did not move itself out of spite, so there was no one to be angry at. The landslide just happened. That is occasionally the nature of things." She thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "You approach a great many things that way. You treat circumstances as things that happened rather than things done to you." "I have found it more useful," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and he thought he might have said something that landed wrong, that the comparison to her own circumstances was too obvious and she might feel it as a suggestion. But then she said, "I am working on that." "I know," he said. "You are doing well at it." She looked at him, and the expression on her face was one of those ones that seemed to hold more than it was quite saying, and he held it for a moment and then looked back at the records, because there was only so much of that kind of looking he could manage without losing his place. In the evenings, they were often the only two at Mrs. Garland's dining table, the boarding house's other occupants being a traveling hardware salesman who was rarely present and an elderly retired schoolteacher named Mr. Fitch, who retired to his room immediately after supper. Mrs. Garland herself was a presence at dinner in the way that a well-placed pillar is a presence in a building, solid and structurally important and not particularly ornamental. They would stay at the table after supper sometimes, the two of them, with the kerosene lamp casting its warm circle, talking. The topics ranged widely. He told her about the Cherokee outlet and the complicated political situation between the cattle ranchers who wanted to use it as a corridor and the Cherokee Nation that had legal treaty rights to it. A situation he found genuinely interesting because of its legal and ethical complexity. She told him about the economic dynamics of small-town credit in cattle country, about the informal debt systems that bound ranchers and storekeepers together, and how they could be exploited by men with capital who understood how dependent those systems were on trust. Once, after a dinner where Mrs. Garland had produced an unexpectedly excellent apple pie, he asked her what she wanted. Not in the immediate sense, not in the legal proceeding sense, but in the wider sense what she wanted when all of this was finished. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, "I want a place that is mine, not borrowed, not rented, not owed to anyone. Mine. It does not have to be large. I want to do work that uses my mind. I want to make my own decisions." She paused. "I know that sounds very simple." "It does not sound simple at all," he said. "It sounds like the things that are hardest to have." She looked at the lamp. "What do you want?" He thought about it. He had not been asked this question in quite this way before, or at least not by anyone whose answer to their own version of it had interested him the way hers did. "I want the same kind of thing, I think," he said. "A place that is chosen rather than inherited, work that means something beyond the pay. And company," he said, and paused, and then said the rest of it, "that I am not in a hurry to leave." She looked at him when he said that last part, and the lamplight was warm on her face, and she said quietly, "Isaac," just his name. And the way she said it told him that she understood exactly what he meant and that she felt the same way, and it was not nothing, that small exchange. It was everything. He did not sleep well that night, not from distress but from something that was very nearly its opposite, the kind of alert, full-hearted wakefulness that comes when life has made a sudden and unexpected turn towards something better than you had been planning for. Henry Marsh's case preparation proceeded efficiently. The handwriting expert, a man named Dr. Folsom, arrived from Kansas City 3 weeks before the hearing date, examined the signature on the forged contract against the letter and 2 additional examples Marsh had obtained through the court process, and produced a 12-page written analysis concluding with a high degree of professional certainty that the contract signature was not made by the same hand as the authentic examples. He further testified to specific technical characteristics in the forged signature that indicated it was produced by someone copying from a model rather than writing naturally. Marsh also obtained, through a federal subpoena, copies of 3 other contracts from Harlan Voss's operation that had been used in similar debt resolution proceedings in the previous 5 years. 2 of those contracts showed irregularities consistent with post-mortem additions, meaning the body of the contract had characteristics indicating it had been completed before a death and then signed afterward, or vice versa. When the hearing date came, Ellen walked into the Federal Circuit courtroom in Wichita with Marsh on one side and Isaac on the other. She was wearing a dress she had purchased from a dressmaker 2 days before the hearing, dark green, simply cut, with nothing about it that was performative or designed to appeal. She wore it the way she wore everything, as if appearance was a thing she acknowledged but was not controlled by. Isaac was not in the courtroom in any official capacity. He sat in the gallery with his surveying notebook on his knee, because he had learned that having something to do with his hands helped him think, and his thinking on this morning was occupied almost entirely by the woman at the front of the room. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Marsh presented the handwriting analysis. Dr. Folsom testified. The letter was entered into evidence. The additional Voss contracts with their irregularities were presented. The opposing counsel, a Wichita lawyer hired by Voss who had evidently not expected the level of preparation Marsh brought, spent most of the hearing on the defensive, and his arguments were the arguments of a man trying to contain damage rather than make a case. The Federal Circuit judge, a man named Oliver Hart who had the appearance and manner of someone who had spent 30 years being absolutely unimpressed by attempts at manipulation, reviewed the evidence with obvious care, asked Marsh 2 pointed clarifying questions, and then issued his ruling. The original debt contract was declared fraudulent. The transferred labor obligation was void. Ellen Keating was declared free of any financial obligation to Harlan Voss or any entity acting on his behalf. The court further directed that the matter of the forged contract be referred to the federal prosecutor for investigation of fraud and potential criminal charges against Harlan Voss. Ellen sat very still when the ruling was read. Then she put her hands flat on the table in front of her and looked at them, and Isaac, from the gallery, could see the exact moment when the weight she had been carrying for 3 years left her. It was visible. It changed the line of her shoulders and the set of her jaw and the angle of her head. He was in the gallery. He could not go to her immediately. He waited until she turned and looked for him, which she did within about 30 seconds, scanning the gallery with those green eyes until they found him. And he raised his hand. Not much, just enough. The same hand that had gone up in the rain at the Caldwell auction, and her expression changed into something that was private and complete and entirely his to have seen. Marsh celebrated with a drink. Isaac and Ellen walked out of the federal courthouse into the late afternoon of a Wichita spring day, the sky a clean and deep blue, the smell of the Arkansas River on the air, the bustle of the cattle town street around them, and for a moment they simply stood on the courthouse steps. Then she did something he was not expecting. She took his hand, not in the formal handshake of their first introduction, but in the way that meant something different, her fingers through his, her grip firm and certain. "Thank you," she said. It was not the same gratitude she had expressed on the auction platform. That one had been careful and distanced, the gratitude of a person who was making clear she did not owe more than was owed. This one was something else entirely. "You did it," he said. "You carried the evidence for 3 years. You kept the letter. You filed the counter-complaint. Marsh presented the case. I only provided the initial money. You walked into the rain and raised your hand," she said, "when no one else did." He looked at her hand in his. Then he said, "I would do it again." "I know," she said. "That is rather significant to me." They walked through Wichita in the late afternoon with their hands still joined, which was observed by several people and entirely unremarked upon, because Wichita in 1879 had considerably more pressing concerns than two people walking hand in hand past the stockyards. He had the double-cross commission to complete. She had, for the first time in 3 years, no immediate obligation to anyone. They sat in Mrs. Garland's parlor that evening, by mutual unspoken agreement avoiding the boarding-house's dining table where Mr. Fitch would be present, and talked until midnight. He told her the double-cross commission would require him to travel back south through the Cherokee Outlet to complete the survey and file the route application. The timeline was approximately 6 weeks. After that, his time was his own until he took another commission. She told him she had been thinking during the case preparation about what she was going to do when the case was finished. She had the skills for bookkeeping and land records, which she had demonstrated over the previous weeks. Marsh had in fact offered her part-time work at his office organizing client files and managing correspondence, which she was considering but which was Wichita, and she was not sure she wanted Wichita. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "I told you," she said. "A place that is mine." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been looking at land records for the past 3 weeks. There is a parcel on the Nineska River, 30 miles southwest of Wichita, that is available for homestead claim under the 1862 Act. 160 acres of river bottom land, good soil, reliable water, mature timber on the north quarter. The claim has been unchallenged for 5 years, which means the previous filer either abandoned it or died without heirs. It can be legally claimed by any citizen in good standing." Ellen looked at him carefully. "Are you telling me this as an opportunity in the abstract?" "I am telling you this," he said, "as an opportunity that I would be interested in pursuing with you, if that is something you would be open to discussing." She was quiet for a moment, and he knew her well enough now to know that her silences were not absence but presence, that she was fully in the room and thinking, and he should let her think. "That would require us to be," she said, "somewhat more formally arranged." "It would," he said. "Is that what you are suggesting?" He met her eyes. He was not a man who was particularly practiced at any of this, but he had found in the previous weeks that the directness they had established between them on the very first morning under the porch in the Caldwell rain was one of the things he valued most, so he continued it. "Ellen," he said, "I have not been in the habit of wanting to stay in any particular place. I have been in the habit of moving, which I told myself was by preference, and which I think now was partly because there was no particular place I wanted to be. I want to be where you are. I believe that is the clearest way to say it." She looked at him. He could see her thinking through it, not the decision itself. He did not think the decision was the thing she was examining, but the implications of it, the magnitude of choosing to trust her life to a direction again after the previous direction had led to an auction platform in Caldwell, Kansas, at dawn. Then she said, "I would like to see the parcel." He smiled. "I can take you there before I leave for the Cherokee Outlet survey. And when you come back from the survey." "If the parcel is what I think it is," he said, "then when I come back we could file the claim together." "Together," she said. "Together," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she said, "Yes, I think I would like that very much." He took her to see the parcel the following week, on a clear May morning with the Nineska River running bright and fast from the spring rains. The land was everything the records had suggested, and more than either of them had quite expected. The river bottom was deep and fertile, the grass tall and rich. The stand of cottonwood and bur oak on the north quarter, throwing a generous shade over a natural clearing that would have been designed by a thoughtful architect if nature had been in the habit of taking commissions. There was a low rise to the east that would catch the morning sun and shelter a building from the northwest winter wind. There was a creek entering from the south that gave a secondary water source. They stood on the rise and looked over the 160 acres in the May morning and said very little, because the land said most of what needed saying. She walked down to the river and put her hand in the current, feeling the cold and the pull of it. He stood on the bank above and watched her, this woman who 3 months ago had been standing on a platform in the rain with no one willing to claim her worth, and who was now standing at the edge of a river she was going to call hers, and he felt something in his chest that he thought was probably the best thing he had ever felt. "It is good land," she said, looking up at him. "Yes," he said. "We should build the house on the rise," she said, with the confidence of someone who has already seen it clearly in her mind. "Face it southeast for the morning light." "Yes," he said again. She climbed back up the bank. She was standing very close to him. The river sound was steady and clean beside them. He put his hand against her cheek, carefully, asking, and she turned into it and put her hand over his and held it there. And then he kissed her, which was neither dramatic nor hesitant but was rather like the closing of a surveyor's final measurement, the line that makes the map complete. He left for the Cherokee Outlet survey 5 days later. The parting was brief and practical and also not easy, which they both acknowledged without making a production of it. 6 weeks, he said. 6 weeks, she said. She was staying at Mrs. Garland's boarding house, working part-time at Marsh's office, and had been in contact with the Federal Land Office about the homestead filing requirements. She was not the kind of woman who waited passively for things to happen, and he knew that she would use the 6 weeks well. He rode south with steady into the Indian Territory, into the rolling red hills and tallgrass prairie of the Cherokee Outlet, which was some of the most beautiful land he had ever surveyed, and which was also the most politically fraught. A corridor that 3 different sets of interests, the Cherokee Nation, the federal government, and the cattle ranchers, all claimed some right to. He worked carefully and thoroughly, recording measurements and landmarks and soil samples, and he did his work well because he always did. But for the first time in his working life, he was also thinking about afterward in a way that was not just the abstract planning of the next commission. He thought about the house on the rise. He thought about the way she had said southeast, for the morning light, with the certainty of someone who knew what she needed and had learned to name it. He thought about spring mornings on the river and evening fires, and the sound of her voice across a table. He wrote to her once from a trading post near the Cimarron River, a letter that was not long but that said clearly that he was well and that he was thinking about her, and that the land down here, while remarkable, was not the land he wanted to be on, and that he was counting the weeks. She wrote back, the letter reaching him at a second trading post 10 days later, telling him that the Federal Land Office had confirmed the homestead parcel's availability, and that Marsh had agreed to serve as a legal witness for the filing, and that she had found a carpenter named Burns in Wichita who was willing to come out and begin preliminary work on the house foundation once the claim was filed, and that she was well, and that she was also counting the weeks. He finished the survey in 5.5 weeks, which was fast by any standard, and filed the preliminary route application at the Federal Land Office in Caldwell on his way north, and then rode the remaining distance to Wichita at a pace that's steady, who was a patient and forgiving horse, managed without complaint. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late June, 1879, covered in 6 weeks of trail dust, with a draft on the double-cross account for his commission that he had not yet cashed, and he went directly to Marsh's office because that was where she would be. She was at a desk near the front window, working through a set of files with the focused attention he recognized, and she looked up when the office door opened, and the expression that crossed her face when she saw him was one that he thought he would remember precisely for the rest of his life. She came around the desk. He stopped inside the door. She crossed the office, and he put his arms around her, trail dust and all, and she let him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, which was enough. They filed the homestead claim the following day together at the federal land office, with Marsh as witness. The clerk stamped the documents and gave them a receipt. The 160 acres on the Nineska River was theirs. Isaac and Ellen were married at the Congregationalist Church on 3rd Street in Wichita on a Saturday in July of 1879, with Henry Marsh as witness on one side and Mrs. Garland, who had apparently decided they were her personal concern, and arrived at the church in her best hat on the other. The minister was the same one who had directed them to Marsh in the first place, a fact that all parties appreciated for its neatness. It was a small ceremony, brief and direct in the way that both of them preferred, and the vows were the traditional ones, which is to say they were exactly right. The carpenter Burns had already poured the foundation on the rise by the time they arrived at the Nineska parcel the following week, with a wagon of supplies and tools, and an energy that was partly the energy of people in their first weeks of marriage, and partly the energy of people building something that is entirely and specifically theirs. The house went up over the summer and into the fall, not quickly, because they were doing much of the work themselves, with Burns guiding the framing and roofing. Isaac found that he was, to his own surprise, a reasonably competent builder. He was methodical and precise, which were the right qualities for it. Ellen discovered that she was not a naturally skilled carpenter, but that she had an excellent eye for proportion and space, and could read Burns's plans and identify structural problems before they became actual problems, which Burns found both irritating and useful. By October, they had a house. It was modest, 4 rooms, solid, with large south-facing windows because Ellen had been specific about the light, and a kitchen that was organized and efficient, and a bedroom with a view east to where the sun rose over the Nineska every morning in colors that changed every day. It was more beautiful than either of them had planned, and less finished than they had hoped, and it was entirely and completely theirs. Isaac took 2 surveying commissions that fall, work he could do within a 2-day ride of home, while Ellen established a bookkeeping practice for several of the smaller ranching operations in the area who could not afford a full-time clerk. By December, they had a settled income, modest but reliable, and the knowledge that the next year would be better than the last, which is the most useful kind of knowledge to have. Harlan Voss, it should be noted, did not go unaddressed. The federal prosecutor in Wichita, acting on the referral from Judge Hart, had opened an investigation. Marsh wrote in November to inform Ellen that Voss had been indicted on 3 counts of contract fraud and 1 count of filing false legal instruments. The indictment meant that his financial operations were under federal scrutiny, which immediately destabilized his credit network and forced several of the county arrangements he had been maintaining, including the one with Magistrate Aldridge, into exposure. Aldridge resigned his position in November under circumstances that the local newspaper described diplomatically as voluntary retirement in light of personal concerns. When Ellen received Marsh's letter and read it at the kitchen table in the house on the Nineska, she read it twice, carefully, and then she set it down and looked out the south window at the winter light on the river, and felt a thing settle that she had not realized was still unsettled, a last remaining tension in something that had been wound very tight for a very long time. Isaac came in from the barn while she was sitting there. He saw the letter and her expression and asked, quietly, what it said. She told him. He sat down across from her at the table, in the same configuration they had occupied at the boarding house table and in Marsh's office and at various campfires and in the land records office, which was already the most natural arrangement in the world. "Is it enough?" he asked, not challenging, genuinely asking, because he understood that legal resolution and personal resolution were not always the same thing, She thought about it. "He will stand before a federal court for what he did," she said. "That is more than I thought was possible when I was standing on that platform in Caldwell. So yes, it is enough." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, which had become so practiced a gesture between them that it was simply part of the language they had developed together, easy and certain. "Then we are done with it," she said. "Then we are done with it," he agreed. Winter on the Nineska was cold and clear and long, and also genuinely beautiful, in a way that both of them found sustainable, because they were the kind of people who found beauty in what was genuinely there, rather than requiring it to be conventionally presented. The river froze at its edges in January, and the cottonwoods on the North Quarter went silver with frost, and the sky turned the pale, brilliant blue that only happens in winter on the plains. They were warm in the house, which Isaac had built solidly for exactly this purpose, and they were well provisioned, and they had each other's company, which was the most essential resource. He read to her in the evenings, from the small collection of books he had accumulated over 8 years of travel, and the larger collection she had found through a Wichita bookseller who offered credit to reliable customers. She was a faster reader than him and had stronger opinions about what she read, which generated some of the best conversations they had. He was partial to natural history and practical science. She preferred history and the occasionally circulated novels, and she made a compelling argument that the novels were actually more instructive about human nature than the natural histories, which he conceded was probably true. In the spring of 1880, she told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen in the early morning while he was making coffee, not dramatically but in the direct way that she did most things, simply saying it clearly while he had his back to the stove. He turned around. She was watching him with that careful, assessing look that she used when she was uncertain how something would land, which meant she was not entirely certain of his reaction even after 8 months of marriage, which made him realize he should probably be more expressive than his natural inclination supported. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in both hands and said, with the complete honesty that had been the founding agreement between them, "This is the best thing you have ever told me." Her expression changed into something that was pure and uncomplicated in a way her expressions rarely were, because she was not given to uncomplicated feelings, and he was glad he had said it right. Their son was born in November of 1880, in the house on the Nineska, delivered by a capable midwife from Wellington named Mrs. Harper, who arrived on horseback 2 days before the birth, and stayed through it with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this successfully many times. He was a healthy, loud boy with dark hair like his mother and gray eyes like his father, which Ellen pointed out was a somewhat redundant combination of traits, and that the child might have been expected to contribute something original. They named him Thomas Keating Keller, after Ellen's father, which was the kind of naming that carries both grief and continuation in equal measure, and which felt exactly right. Isaac held his son in the kitchen of the house he had built on the river he had chosen, in the company of the woman who had been standing on a platform in Caldwell, with her wrists bound and her chin up, and her green eyes fixed on a point beyond a crowd of men who did not see her worth. And he felt the accumulated weight of every decision and every road and every surveyor's line that had brought him to this exact moment. This specific warm kitchen with this specific small boy and this specific woman, and he thought that if land survey was about understanding where you were and mapping it accurately, then this was the most precise he had ever been in his life. He was exactly here. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. Thomas turned out to be a baby of strong opinions and considerable lung capacity, which Ellen said was entirely his father's fault for having built the house so solidly that it echoed. Isaac said it was entirely her fault for the opinions, since the lung capacity at least he was willing to claim. She threw a dish towel at him. He caught it. Thomas continued his evaluation of the world at volume. It was a perfectly ordinary morning in the house on the Nineska River, which meant it was exactly what both of them had spent their different lives trying to find. In the years that followed, Isaac expanded his surveying practice into a small but respected firm, hiring a second deputy surveyor when the work outgrew one man's capacity, and organizing the operation from the house on the river, which acquired an additional room, and then another as the family required the space. Ellen's bookkeeping practice grew into something more substantial, an actual formal accounting service that handled 3 of the larger ranching operations in the county, work she did from an office in Wellington 2 days a week, and from the house the rest of the time, arriving at solutions to financial puzzles with the same precise pleasure she had once found in balancing a store ledger. They were, by 1882, known in the surrounding county as the Kellers of the Nineska, which was not fame or prominence but was something better, which was the kind of reputation for reliability and honesty and fair dealing that makes a person genuinely useful to their community and genuinely valued by it. Ellen sent a letter to Patterson, the county clerk in Wichita who had helped her file the original countercomplaint from jail, and told him what had become of it. Patterson wrote back with a warmth that suggested the outcome had given him considerable satisfaction, and the knowledge that his quiet act of conscience had mattered. She framed the letter from Patterson and put it on the wall of the home office beside a simple map Isaac had drawn of their 160 acres, a surveyor's accurate rendering of the river bottom and the Cottonwood North Quarter, and the rise where the house stood, with the compass rose in the corner drawn with the particular care he brought to anything that was meant to last. The second child, a daughter they named Clara after Mrs. Finch, the Good Samaritan who had found Ellen on the bank of Bluff Creek and fed her soup, and thereby contributed significantly to the chain of events that had led to everything else, arrived in the spring of 1883. Clara was a quieter baby than Thomas, which the entire household appreciated, and she had Ellen's high cheekbones and Isaac's preference for observing situations before participating in them, which would serve her well in life. Thomas, by that point a sturdy 2-year-old with the navigational instincts of a young explorer and very little respect for boundaries of any kind, was deeply unimpressed by his sister for approximately 3 weeks, and then became her most devoted protector, a transformation that both his parents found amusing and appropriate. In the evenings, in the house on the Nineska, after the children were in their beds, Isaac and Ellen would sit by the fire or in the summer on the porch facing southeast, facing the morning light's direction even in the dark, and talk or not talk as the evening required. There was a particular quality to their silence together that had always been one of the first things he had noticed about her, the comfort of it, the way it was not absence but a form of presence, and it had only deepened over the years into something that was fundamental to the architecture of their life. She would sometimes take out the letter her father had written 2 weeks before his death, the one that had been the key piece of evidence and had ridden in her satchel through everything, through the Wichita jail and the broken axle and Caldwell and Wellington and the land records office. She would read it and be quiet with it and put it away, and he would let her do that in peace, which was the right thing to do. And sometimes she would look up from the letter and look at him with those green eyes that still, after years and children and seasons and work and ordinary extraordinary life, had the capacity to do something specific and irreversible to his chest. And she would say something that was not grand or elaborate, but that contained everything. She said once, on a spring evening in 1884, watching the sunset go orange and red over the Nineska, with Thomas asleep inside and Clara in her arms and the smell of the river on the warm air, I used to try to imagine what would come next when things were very bad, and I could not. I could not imagine anything that was actually good enough to make it through to. I just had to keep going without a picture of it. He looked at her. And now, she looked at the river. Now I have the picture, she said, and it is better than anything I would have imagined. He reached over and took her hand, the same hand he had held on the courthouse steps in Wichita, the same hand that had been bound with hemp rope on a platform in the rain, the hand that wrote accounts and made coffee and held children and turned pages of books and pointed at survey maps and had belonged from the first moment he saw it only to herself. He held it, and the river ran, and the sun went down over the Kansas plain, and the stars came out over the Nineska one by one in the wide dark sky, and the house that was theirs on the land that was theirs held their sleeping children and their accumulated ordinary remarkable life, and it was more than enough. It was, by any accurate accounting, everything.